This is the Owens Recovery Science Podcast.
All right, welcome back. End of year Owens Recovery Science Podcast number 51, baby. We just did 50, and Kyle forgot to let us know that we hit a milestone, dude. When I turned 50, I had a COVID 50th birthday. And so 50s, it's a big deal to me, Kyle, and you just let that one slide through the cracks. So end of year, we are doing a different style here. We don't have a guest on. We're not doing a paper. We're just going to do an end of year wrap up. Talk about what the year was for blood flow restriction in 2022, interesting things we might have learned or did not learn. The whole damn what the heck happened up in New York scenario, if people haven't heard about that one, as well as whatever else. We got a lot of questions that were sent in, so we're going to hit on some of these questions as well. We had our Christmas party Saturday night. I'm still, I think, hungover from the Saturday night Christmas party. Zach, you weren't here, man, but it got wild at the end. By the end, we had E-stem on our IT guy's forehead and cranking it up.
No hiding bourbon bottles.
Yeah. I was really disappointed. I was really disappointed about that, Zach.
It was at my house, so I would have hid my own bourbon bottle. We don't bring that up. My wife still gets pissed that I stole bourbon from a hotel bar.
I can attest to that. I did actually bring it up at the Christmas party, and I was kind of disappointed I missed it last year, and immediately Johnny's wife's eyes cut over at him. I just changed the vibe.
How did you get arrested, Johnny? Stealing bourbon from behind the bar.
The final straw was Johnny mentioned his still missing jacket.
I was just gonna say, low crawling in there and then somehow losing the jacket though.
I lost my damn credit card yesterday. I think I left it at a restaurant. My life. All right. So Kyle's leading the way on this end of your podcast. So Kyle, take it away, brother.
Well, if I'm gonna lead a podcast, Johnny, by God, the first thing we're gonna talk about is something I know Zach really wants to talk about, something we failed to talk about on our last podcast, and that is our
Justin Verlander.
Our friends, the Houston Astros, are the World Series champions, and so I get to actually hold my head high around Los Angeles again for once, because I've been hanging it for a while. So I'm excited about that. It's good.
And then, but losing Verlander, man, we should have done everything we can to keep everybody on this team. But I think I love the Mets too.
You're not competing with Cohen. That guy is whatever he needs to do to buy a World Series. Yep,
making it rain, baby.
$43 million for a year.
We had a starting pitcher on the Astros that's pretty stinking good. He didn't even pitch really in the playoffs. So I don't know how many 40-year-olds Cohen's gonna throw money at to try to throw fastballs. But I think I'll stick with our younger guys. I'm all right with where we are. Verlander, he did a great job, and he will be missed for sure.
We'll miss his wife in the stands, that's for sure.
Yeah, nobody's complaining about. Nobody's happy to see. Wait, what's his wife's name?
Kate Upton.
Kate Upton. I thought I was starting to say Kate Hudson, but I knew that wasn't right.
Yeah, about 6 cup sizes different.
Oh my word! Hysterical. I know Kate Upton because she trains with that guy Ben Bruno, and Ben Bruno is, if you don't follow Ben Bruno on Instagram, he's a fantastic follow. He's a celebrity trainer guy, and he does little bits about side planks, and he's laying on his side on his couch talking about planking and how great it is. So I just find that rather entertaining. So anyway, we digress. So yeah, we're gonna do just kind of a recap kind of podcast here. Throw some questions. We threw a bunch of questions out on social media and via email to just sort of see what things people were curious about. I put it out like an hour before we were going to record this today to see if we got any kind of last minute stuff. And the very first thing that came back, you know what it was? It was Michael Siegenthaler, our buddy. He's just south of Tulsa a bit. Siegenthaler he's a literal like cattle rancher. Like he raises his own cattle and everything, grass-fed cattle. I got to tell you, best steak I've ever had in my life. Actually, I did a class out there, and we went back to his house, and he did a steak flight for me. So
Wow.
we went prime rib, what am I thinking of?
Come on, man.
Come
Strip,
on, man.
filet,
Yeah.
Ribeye.
Oh my
ribeye.
word.
Yeah.
I just totally went blank. We went filet, strip, ribeye, and sirloin. And just tasted them like side by side, which I don't know if y'all have ever done that, but it was super interesting to do that and just kind of get the different flavor profiles. Filet was absolutely the best, but then strip was actually better than ribeye, and I was surprised by that.
No way, man.
No way.
No way.
Yeah, dead serious. I didn't expect it at all. I always go ribeye, but
And where did the what was it, a top sirloin?
oh, I don't know.
Because
Yeah, I'm not sure.
they call that the poor man's fillet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure, but it was very interesting and super cool. So anyway, Siegenthaler, he wanted to know if I have any actual evidence, like controlled studies, for why left brisket is better than right brisket.
You have to explain left brisket if you haven't. Have you done that
Zach,
before?
you want to explain it?
Well,
Zach knows it.
well,
Zach knows it. He may or may not have turned me on to it. My dad
I
tells me
absolutely
he told me
did.
first, but Zach definitely jogged my memory on it. So
Yeah.
carry on, Zach. Tell us the story.
well, it's just because we do barbecue here in Georgia.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
boy.
yeah. I
Let me
mean,
tell you about Zach's barbecue sauce.
I did fire up the pit boss that you recommend for me. I fired that up last night to do my
Nice.
snack sticks. Not to deviate too far off topic, but elk I think is far better than beef. But we'll
Yeah.
save that for another
Yeah.
100%. 100%.
I'm down
but
to
either-
be convinced.
Okay. But basically what it goes to is the tenderness of the left versus the right brisket. And supposedly the theory is that beef lie on the left side, and then when they go to basically stand up, they push with their right pec, so to speak, and so it creates more tension, and it's just tougher cut of meat.
That's more developed. It's leaner. It doesn't have as much fat and it doesn't have as much flavor. It's not as tender.
That is the
Yeah.
theory behind the left versus right brisket.
but no
There's some-
RCT. We've never seen a
No.
study, right?
No, that's not true. I have a study of beef lying behavior. I show it in my course every time when I talk about left brisket, because we start talking about all the inner marbling of the fat and everything, and I find ways to talk about barbecue regardless. So,
Well, we just know how they lay. We don't know if it tastes better.
yeah,
right?
this is true.
Yeah,
We
it
don't
makes
have a
sense.
side to side tasting. So I guess really we should put this back on Michael, since he's an actual cattle rancher.
Yeah.
We actually have the ability to conduct this study, in conjunction with Siegenthaler. So Impact Rehab Wellness, and it is not. Hold on, it's not Okmulgee. It's Okmulgee, I think is correct. Is how you say the town. It's just south of Tulsa, about 45 minutes south of Tulsa. We'll be doing a brisket tasting study in the future through
All right, Mike. We'll fund it, man. Whatever you need from us, we'll fund this because we need an answer.
I've got
So-
the smoker.
Yeah, he's gonna blind us to left and right.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
send it to us with a number on it. We cook it, same temperature, same smoke, same
we go.
everything, and do a tasting.
And we'll find
All
out.
I'm in.
And that's us making the world better, right? 2023.
Yeah.
So more to come on that, y'all. Be
right.
sure to stay tuned. So we got a few questions over all our social channels and everything. This first one we're just gonna kind of throw out. I think probably Johnny and Ben will sort of tackle this answer here. It comes from Jordan Lindberg, who is at Augustana University. Okay, I think that's in maybe, where is that? You guys know where
It's in the
Augustana?
Dakotas, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not
Oh,
sure.
good grief, I was going to say Florida.
You're thinking St. Augustine.
That's St. Augustine.
That's
St.
probably true. Yeah, this is true. Not Florida. Augustana is not Florida. We've established that. Ooh, good. Glad we get that out of the way. Jordan said that in March of 2019, we had some MLS athletic trainers on the podcast. That was Throwing It Back. That was Kurt Andrews from Sporting KC. That was Paul Lombardo from the Seattle Timbers. No, that's Portland Timbers. Seattle Sounders.
There you go.
And then it was Reed from Chicago.
Crazy Reed.
Reed Whitney, right? Whitney?
Yep.
Yeah.
From the Chicago, was it Fire? Did they change that name? Is it still the Fire?
Still a fire, I think.
For some reason,
Yeah.
I thought for some reason I heard that they had changed that name. I don't know why.
Why he's
Anyway.
like fire got offended, so they had to change it to something else.
Yeah, I didn't know. No, I know exactly where. Do not go where you're about to think about going.
This just shows that Kyle doesn't keep up with MLS, which is
He just blew it.
a problem.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
MLS.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I do not follow MLS closely. I don't follow any sport closely except baseball, basically. So anyway, we had those guys on the podcast. Great podcast. Reed had like a dryer or something going in the background. So if you hear this annoying noise, that's Reed's fault. There was something going on there. But they talked a lot about using BFR for some recovery and performance strategies, using it with endurance exercise. And then recently, in the last month, the Philadelphia Eagles, Zach's NFL team, there was a cool little social media post of their guys on bikes pedaling. It looked like it was probably like the O-line or something.
It was.
They were all on bicycles pedaling with BFR after the game. So he was kind of curious, sort of like what evidence is there and any kind of insight we might sort of provide into parameters about using BFR in almost more like of an endurance kind of recovery session. Any sort of protocols, limb inclusion pressure, that sort of thing. So I don't know, Johnny, you want to maybe start that and then we'll let Ben kind of chip in a bit.
Yeah, so I think what he's getting at too, well, not only parameters, but what's the difference in maybe doing a bike BFR for recovery versus just using an IPC type protocol. And so I think we've always fallen back on, and when Patterson and I spoke at CSM, this was thrown at him, what would you do if you had the choice of just IPC or doing something that has a contraction? He said for anything, I would add a contraction to it. And so I think that's one thing that if your players or whoever you're going to do this with are up to at least doing a little bit of activity with a cuff on, you're probably going to get a little bit more bang for your buck, we would think, just from a mechanistic and physiological standpoint, than just having the cuffs on themselves. But just the cuffs on themselves is easy. And sometimes if you're smoked after a game or something like that, I mean, I can't believe these O-linemen are after that game are just ready to jump on a bike and go. I can barely motivate myself to do the bike on just a day when I haven't done crap. But good on them, and we know those guys well up there, and they're super well trained and been doing this for a long time. So I think they obviously know what's the right direction to go. The other thing with adding just the bike to it, and if you take our course or here, Jeremy's got a good paper on this as well. There's the passive application of BFR. There's the low load resistance application of BFR, but the bike or walking protocol lives in the middle of that. And so you get a little bit of muscle contraction with these bike or walking protocols, but not as much as you get with lifting low load. So throwing the cuff on after a game and doing a little bit of contraction on a bike or walking on a treadmill is going to probably stimulate a little bit more than just laying there passively. I think if you're saying what's some interesting research from a bike protocol with BFR from a recovery standpoint, I think Danny Christiansen's study was probably the coolest one in my mind, where he had individuals train, what was it, 6 weeks? I think
6 weeks.
6 weeks on a bike with one leg had a cuff on it, the other leg didn't. And then he measured the ability for glucose uptake after doing that 6 week protocol. And the glucose uptake on the leg that had the cuff on was significantly higher. So you basically recharged the muscle, and he showed it exactly. The mechanism was the GLUT4 receptor, which is like a straw that comes out of your muscle and soaks up all that glucose. So they made them more sensitive to glucose uptake and actually got the GLUT4 to take it up. And so if these guys are doing that regularly, just kind of 6 weeks of training on a bike, even just after the game, they might be making themselves more sensitive to, from a recovery standpoint, of just getting more juice back into the muscle. So I think that's probably, in my mind, kind of the coolest way to look at it. Ben?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think, we don't really have any research at this point that's done any kind of comparison on which would be better. It's really speculative on, is exercise better than passive? And I have to think the exercise would be, based on everything we think, it's probably just doing more than what we get from a passive standpoint. But like you mentioned, passive still does something. We've had several podcasts talk about parameters. And so that's what we haven't really gone through on the question here is from an IPC standpoint, it's really simple. Parameters are basically you need to get 100% occlusion if you're not doing exercise. The most common is 5 minutes inflation followed by 5 minutes deflation, and you do 3 rounds of that. And from a recovery standpoint, it sounds like you probably want to get that started as quickly as you can after the competition or the exercise is completed,
or before.
To really get, or before, or 24 hours before.
Yeah, or 3 times before,
or 3, yeah, or just do it every day leading up to it. So and then with the exercise, I think just kind of sticking to the parameters that we know as of right now, on the leg, this hasn't really been looked at as much with endurance as far as occlusive pressure. We've always kind of recommended the 80% occlusion on the leg just because that's what we have from resistance exercise, but that's pretty freaking brutal on the bike. So if you are going to go 80% occlusion, maybe you're just doing shorter rounds of occlusion and having some sort of inflate deflate happening depending on the time you're spending on the bike. Maybe you're doing something like Luke's pain protocol where it's like 3 minutes on, 1 minute deflate, and you do something like that, or 5 on, 1 off. Or you could potentially, I think, go at a little lower pressure if you're going to do a little longer duration on the bike. You could probably take it down just a bit. So that's where I'm at with it. And most common thing that we see in the literature is somewhere around 15 minutes of exercise on the bike as a pretty common time point. And
it kind of comes out to the same amount of occlusive time. You got 15 minutes occlusive time IPC. You should probably hit, we think target around 15 minutes. We're having to just speculate of what everyone's has done and published, but 15 minutes of endurance exercise, kind of is maybe the minimum threshold. Who knows? We really don't know that. But IPC maybe is more catabolic sparing and adding the contraction. Maybe you're getting a little bit of the catabolic and the anabolic side. So you're getting more of a little bit of a 1-2 punch. And just to review, the studies that have looked at IPC have shown less muscle damage through blood draw on creatine kinase levels, as well as a quicker return to performance, be it strength or some of these performance tests like sprints and things like that. Mm-hmm. So you get there faster, 72, 48 hours versus the control groups were typically still significantly down on strength.
Yep.
What about you guys? Anything?
No, I was just going to say, I think, kind of on my end, sort of tidying this question up a bit. I think number one, it goes back to, no, you did for sure. But I think it goes back to, what did the athlete just do? Right. And so that's kind of where Johnny's coming at this from the perspective of, man, these offensive linemen, they just finished a game and here they are on a bike kind of exercising and doing something that's somewhat intense where, you might just kind of think of like right after a game, maybe you do kind of do like a passive sort of thing, then inflate, deflate, but then perhaps during a week, maybe you're trying to kind of help that recovery by adding a bit of exercise and that sort of thing. And I think this is kind of an interesting question to say, all right, does the duration matter, or could we just use like an 80% and accelerate some fatigue and maybe only just do 2 minutes, one minute on pedaling, or 2 minutes on pedaling a bike, maybe an inflate or a deflate of a minute, and then you do say 4 rounds of that. Could you shrink that time down, by kind of accelerating some of that hypoxia. There's a ton of questions in terms of parameters, I think, out there still. So I think you're building it off of what did the athlete do, and what can we get them doing, always kind of favoring getting the individual moving, getting some muscular contraction and that sort of thing. So that's where I kind of land on all of it. And some of the teams have kind of messed around with, in particular, the passive parameters, because even just asking an athlete to sit for 25 minutes and do 5 on 5 off is kind of a big ask. So could you shrink it to 5 on, maybe 1 or 2 minutes off, and then cycle through that and shave a bit of time there? Could you do a shorter inflate and again, in this scenario, we're talking passive 100%.
There's so many variables, it's gonna be so hard to figure that out. I would love to, there's these responders, non-responders, all sorts of things. And then it's like, now let's change the variables of rest periods, or inflation periods. Cause I'm with you, man, that 25 minutes, that's a long time to just lay there. And we're living off of animal data to show us that from the IPC kind of medical literature that's been looking at this for organ issues or brain problems. So yeah,
I think the other thing too is also just kind of considering, well, what sport are we even talking about? And does this application even potentially have a benefit here? Because maybe it's challenging the system in a way that the training for the sport does not. With football, you can kind of see that a little bit, because football is kind of like high intensity, quick, very, very type 2, very kind of sort of anaerobic,
short burst,
short bursts. And here you have kind of this lengthy sort of slow building hypoxia, is just the demands of the application of the cuff and the duration of it is that providing some sort of benefit to, say, an American football player, where it might not to like a European football player. If we're to use the is it European football?
That would be soccer.
Oh yeah, soccer. Soccer. Yes. As we call it here in the United States. Go ahead.
There's not a ton of, you look at, there's a mix in the studies, there's some pretty good ones that show us stuff, but we get so much anecdotal reports, and you got to be careful with anecdotes, but we talk to these teams all the time, and just like talking about Verlander, the Mets. There's like, man, some of our pitchers who do just this IPC, they're throwing so much better within a couple of days. We're measuring, we're seeing that they're throwing better. So, from looking at it from just through the teams, there are a lot of players that really seem to be benefiting, even just from the IPC application alone. Mm-hmm. What's interesting though, is I think we always hear with the athletes, recovery, right? So they're kind of doing it. Can they get back to playing a little bit, at better performance a few days later, or for pain? They're doing this pregame for pain. I don't know if I've really had anyone from Olympics to pros to college say they've done it from a performance application, like the swimming ones, like the sprint cycle ones. Did they put it on before and they're seeing some sort of enhanced performance? That would be really interesting to try and figure out. Have y'all had anyone say they've done an athlete?
Well, the Rams have done a little bit, kind of just like, very, very light sort of exercise stuff prior to like practices and workouts and that kind of thing. Just almost more using it like a warm up rather than say like, hey, I'm actually trying to help this person perform better. I've heard similar things from some baseball teams, but that I feel like that's typically kind of how we're hearing it used. It probably just again goes back to the demand of the sport. If you're doing an intense cycling bout or swimming bout, it's like you do this thing and then you go really intense for kind of a short duration. And you're trying to really kind of enhance some of those things that maybe the IPC has an ability to manipulate versus like a 2-hour practice.
2 hour, it might have to be a
4-hour game or something like that. So
I would love to see a reliever doing it right before he comes in, a closer, and just like, dude, he is throwing 100. Because if it's anything like that swimming study, that's freaking nuts. How much it improves some of those people's performance just doing it right before their swim, like. Brad
Well-
Lambert, get on that one.
Yeah.
Well, and most of what we know about the pre-IPC for performance is an increase in time to exhaustion, right? I mean, that's the most common thing out there. So I think the important piece that Kyle brought up is what are the demands? And, you know, maybe you could use that pre-throwing, like you're saying, Johnny, but, you know, MLB is so constrained on what they'll let their pitchers do from a pitch count standpoint. I wonder if we're really going to see any changes there. But yeah, no, it'd be super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're hoping to get more data because we're partners now with the NFL PFAPs.
Yep.
And so we've always worked closely with them, but we are an official elite partner. That's up there with like Gatorade status. They're an elite partner as well. And so those guys are going to allow us to get more information from them and sort of test some of these things out. So I think that's going to be cool this next year, trying to steal whatever cool info we can get internally with them and then turn it into studies.
That's exciting for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that was awesome. We rambled on that for a
Yeah.
little while there. It was good. Zach, how's it
And
going?
Jordan, that's a great name too. Lindbergh, you know, there's a Lindbergh who's published a bunch of BFR papers out there. So yeah, physiological.
I was thinking of the Hindenburg. That's what I was.
No. No,
Charles Lindbergh. That's a guy.
Oh God.
Didn't he do something with air travel?
There's a Lindbergh in Per Argard's lab.
all
that
over
has
the
a
place today. Good
Yeah.
God. Well,
You're
that was
still
a
drunk
good
from the
choice to
party,
have
Kyle.
pot. No, I'm not. In fact, I didn't have anything to drink at all yesterday. Matter of fact, so very much sober, which maybe that's
the problem.
Oh, that's the
Yeah,
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the issue. I don't know. Zach, what's going on, dude?
Not much, just listening.
Yeah, you're doing. I know you were just dying to kind of jump in there, but we got other stuff in queue for you. So
That's
and you got to talk Calpains and all that other stuff you like to talk on the IPC podcast. So
Well, do you have anything, Zach?
you really want if you really want to hear Zach's thoughts, go back to that podcast.
You know, I was gonna say, I think potentially tying in, like talking about different parameters with the IPC, and it kind of hints on what Danny Christiansen showed in that earlier paper from 2022, where he looked at the mechanistic response with GLUT4 transporters. And one of the other groups in that study was a systemic hypoxia group. And what he actually saw or showed was the group that did the BFR aerobic exercise had a significantly greater GLUT4 translocation to the kind of cell membrane, so to speak. So what they speculated from that was what really wasn't so much due to either pure hypoxia or the contraction mediated responses, metabolites from the muscle. He thought it was more so from the inflation deflation. And ultimately, it's the same as that study that you mentioned, Johnny, where he showed an increase in glucose uptake out of the thigh. There was basically 9 inflations. So he did 3 sets of 3 bouts of 2 minutes of exercise. Yeah. And so going back then to this IPC, maybe potentially varying kind of the parameters and whatnot, there might be something to, decreasing the rest time, but having, altering or increasing the number of inflations, so to speak.
More frequent bouts. Yeah.
Yeah. So you get like, and what he speculated was it was the sheer stress on the vascular tissue that drove that response. And then on the performance side of things, there was a systematic review that showed ultimately the real big benefit with IPC is on the aerobic or more endurance or aerobic side of things. And then as you basically transition from aerobic exercise to strength or more of that glycolytic type stuff to explosive strength, the real benefit just tapers off. So the biggest benefit, say, would be like more so running, 5Ks, things like that. And then as you do some strength training, there might be a benefit, but it's reduced. And then when you do a jumping or explosive task, it just really, there's not really a benefit there whatsoever. And I think that ultimately goes back to how IPC was discovered and the premise behind that. with limiting kind of the progression into the glycolytic substrates to limit the exhaustion of those substrates. But
yeah. On the explosive, I think what's Todd's work at USC from our podcast with him. Hopefully that paper is going to come out soon. Heavy eccentrics on one limb or light BFR on the other limb over 6 weeks. They both significantly increase pretty much to almost the same level explosive tasks. So they're single leg explosive jumps as well as strength. So there can be something for the strength and explosive side from the BFR.
Yeah. I meant more so just from IPC.
Yeah, just like yeah.
I want to back up a bit, Zach, because sometimes I think we throw this word out there, and I don't think we've ever really talked about what it actually means. So you mentioned shear stress, right? And shear stress would essentially be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I would define it.
Having a high school daughter. Sheer stress.
Hey, Kylie was awesome at the party. Like, she was super helpful.
That's my young one. The one that wasn't here.
The other one. But shear stress is essentially the stress on endothelial tissue, or kind of these inner linings of the vascular system. So your artery, your vein. And essentially is how quickly that blood is kind of moving through the vascular system. So things that will increase shear stress might be heart rate and blood pressure. Yeah.
You have that. And then you have, like, I would say in the context of IPC and whatnot, just the pure, the reactive hyperemic response.
Well, that's where you're skipping ahead. So you're skipping ahead. Right? So this is where I'm going, right? So my point is, at some point, your nervous system decides, holy crap, I'm not getting any kind of shear stress, right? Distal to the cuff, or something's different. Maybe I'm hypoxic. Who knows what that signaling kind of cascade is, but ultimately the application of that cuff is creating some sort of nervous system afferent feedback to the central nervous system, distal to the cuff. And that feedback is, yo, dude, something's not right down here, right? And so our nervous system can do a couple of things, maybe there's more, but in my head, there's a couple of things. It could increase blood pressure to try to push past and just, manhandle and force blood into and past that impediment, which is the cuff, or it could increase heart rate, right? And so we would kind of need to know, how long does it take for that to happen? How long does it take for the nervous system to recognize, I'm not getting what I need down here. I'm going to create some vasodilation. I'm going to increase blood pressure. I'm going to increase heart rate. And once we know that number, now we deflate. If it's a shear stress thing, is kind of where I'm going, right? When we know that number, how long do we have to create full limb occlusion for in order for these things to be manipulated by the nervous system? And then we let it go. And then does that number change over time, right? Like, if we do IPC routinely, does it take longer for that to happen kind of distal to the cuff? So I think just kind of from a parameters perspective, it's kind of interesting too, right? So shear stress, I wanted to make sure that we defined it, because I don't know that we have. And we know that shear stress really affects the nitric oxide cascade. It has an effect on, the pliability of our vascular system and those sorts of things that are pretty important for a healthy vascular system. So that's kind of where I was going. So if I didn't hit where you were going, Zach, jump in there, because that's kind of, I just want to make sure we kind of set the stage, right, before we kind of,
and then basically you get that from the nitric oxide response. I think largely is the vasodilation effect of when you release that tourniquet or allow blood flow to resume, you get a surge of blood flow distal to where the cuff was.
Which small doses of things are good. If it's on for a long time, you get this ischemic reperfusion, and that can cause injury.
That's right.
And that is what you see from surgeries, or when people are like, should I leave this on for an hour? It's like, no, because then we're not seeing what we want.
More is not always better.
Yeah.
Well, we talked for a very long time on.
All right, wrap it up. Good job, fellas. We're out.
One question.
Thank you, Jordan.
You get us rolling, Jordan. You never know. But this is kind of why it's fun to do these sort of kind of maybe less structured things and just banter back and forth. So I like it. Zach, so you have probably the most experience sort of in our next topic. So we had just kind of keyed this one up for you. Justin Lin, I think not Justin Lin, good grief, Kyle.
Lee.
Justin Lee. Holy smokes, I can't even read this stupid thing in front of me. I don't remember. I think he emailed this to us. I don't think it was an Instagram deal. He wanted to know, would BFR be appropriate and effective for patients with fibromyalgia? And then he just kind of threw in, or any kind of other widespread pain or rheumatic conditions. And Zach, you had said you've kind of, it sounds like maybe more that fibromyalgia population you got a decent amount of experience with. So, and you're actively kind of working with some rheumatologists. So talk to us a little bit about like your thoughts there.
Yeah, so we have in the building that I work in, we have rheumatologists on the first floor. We have 3 rheumatologists, and they'll refer to us for various conditions. And RA is extremely common. And then with that, you'll get fibro as well. So they'll send up those patients, and then we work with just kind of whether it's a chronic pain type of a deal or what have you. I would say the approach that we do is pretty similar as what we would do with our general orthopedic patients. And what I mean is you just gradually introduce them to the exercise and see where they're at and see what they can tolerate. The progression overall may be slower. What you may end up doing maybe just initially, I think the individual in question is coming off of shoulder surgery. So maybe what you do is you put the cuff on them and have them do like the UBE. We don't really have any studies aerobically in the upper extremity, but we do it quite often. And I think it's pretty common with folks to put it on the UBE or put the cuff on while someone's doing the UBE. And from there, that just gives them a chance to kind of acclimate to the cuff, see what it's about, and then kind of progress from there would be ultimately what we do in a clinic. Exercise wise, you can run the gamut. I tend to just keep it pretty simple. Prone table exercises, side lying, external rotation, and that's pretty much about it. If they're really limited in what they can do, then maybe we just do range of motion, active range of motion type stuff. Again, that's a way for them to kind of acclimate to the cuff, and then ultimately see how they feel during the session, after the session, and then progress as tolerated from there.
Yeah. Is there anything that you might kind of caution against? Like, I think I would maybe avoid this or that, like just off the top of your head.
I think the biggest thing is, it's a gradual progression, because a lot of times folks with fibro are reluctant to do things that they're not familiar with or that they've done previously and they have a known painful response to. And so I don't try to force it. I'll like introduce it and say, hey, I'd like to try this. This is the reason why I would like to try it. What do you think? And then we can kind of go from there. But I don't necessarily force or really kind of, get necessarily to failure immediately with those people. Sometimes I think you have to meet people where they are, not where I want them to be, and, kind of get them to where I need them is, I would say, the approach.
I like that last bit there for sure. I think sometimes what we miss is kind of keeping our eyes on that prize and where we're going. I think sometimes we as clinicians, we kind of come at it from the perspective of this is what you have to do, right? And so we think, okay, they got to start there. They got to start at a 20% load and an 80% pressure, and they got to get all 75 reps, and they got to get failure. And that's not really how things go down. It might be what it looks like in a research study, but that's not how you really manage a patient. I don't think that's how any of us have kind of always approach this. I mean, I just had in the last 24 hours, 2 different people kind of reaching out to me just personally, not even asking podcast questions, but it sort of fits with what we're talking about today. And one is within the DoD, they just got some units over in Guam, and she was wanting to know, well, like just little hacks about how to get started. And I'm like, well, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about it, right? I mean, number one, you're going to take the person's limb occlusion pressure. So you're going to get a picture right then and there. There's a little snapshot of how's this person just going to handle full occlusion on an arm or full occlusion on the leg. And the reality is most of the time when we're talking about tolerance, we're typically talking about lower extremity. Like, I don't think I've ever had anyone tap out on 40% or 50% pressure in their upper extremity. Like, people do not have a difficult time tolerating that level of restriction in an arm customarily. Not to say that they won't, because I very much want to kind of avoid absolutes there, but at minimum you get kind of a picture with that limb occlusion pressure measurement, right? And then from there, I mean, one of the things I think I did probably more than anything is I would just underdose the load. I'd find a way that they could do and be able to execute. And I'd be like, all right, let's try this. This is kind of the highest pressure. This is sort of where we want to get you. And then we can just start. And then from there, it made it easy on me because now I'm just trying to progress the load. But sometimes people don't tolerate that, maybe that high pressure. And then you could always drop the pressure, right? You could maybe deflate during the rest period. Although I don't think I would really deflate every rest period, but maybe like, after that second or third set we deflate, and then maybe after the maybe it's like the latter 2 sets that we're deflating for. So there's just, maybe you're starting with shortened range of motion, or some kind of just like you said, pedaling the arm bike, or something that's people have context for. They're like, okay, this is familiar to me, pedaling a bicycle. Now all we've done is we've kind of added this cuff, right? And then people go, well, that was different. I've never felt that when I pedaled a bike. And so now you just kind of added a layer to something that they're familiar with. So I think, like you started off saying, you're not necessarily approaching it any differently than you would a typical orthopedic patient. There's still a human being in front of you. You got to kind of figure out, where can I begin with this person and be successful, right? And then maybe you might start way away from where you really think you need to get, but that's okay as long as you're moving towards where you need to be, right? So we kind of have in our mind that 20%, 30% load, whatever pressure, high level of effort, and can we get our 10 sets per week and that sort of thing. I mean, I think one of the things that I love about exercise, and I say this a lot in our classes, but I know when a person leaves the clinic if they did enough to get muscle that day, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you really know exercise, you can answer that question. And I think that's so much of the message that we have when we teach these classes is, let's kind of actually manipulate people's physiology. Let's actually kind of create some change. And we at least have an idea every time they leave whether or not they did enough, right? Yeah. And it's okay if they didn't do enough that day, but you kind of have to know that answer to be able to figure out how to get there, So
I think that's one of the things that definitely gets missed. And one of the courses I did here recently, one of the guys goes, the way I feel right now is not how like the trainees feel when they leave the clinic. And it was at a military base. And I said, yeah, that's probably, like, it's good to know that now, but just putting a tourniquet on someone is not going to create magic, and it's not going to create muscle growth. You still have to load them. You still have to work with them. What it does is it just reduces the threshold that's required to get the response that we need, but it still requires effort. And sometimes I think like folks miss that point. They're like, well, we're doing BFR, so I know at the end, like, we're going to grow muscle, we're going to get stronger, and you still have to train it, and they should be somewhat fatigued whenever they leave. They should feel like they just worked.
Well, for me, typically with these patients, I give them to my interns.
I can attest to that. Yeah. I still remember those days. Like, hey, I'm going over to the ISR. I need you to see this patient.
Yeah, I got a meeting. Dan, I got a meeting.
Yeah.
No, well, Zach, have you seen the analgesic response with these folks where they get done, they're like, man, my pain's better, even like a systemic kind of?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat like we've said, like with CRPS, where, and I was going to follow that up with the previous, what I was saying was, I don't want it to come across like it's 100%. Everyone tolerates it. You know, we just do it. Yeah. There's certainly like some people who really, they can tolerate it. They tolerate it well. Whether there's some biopsychosocial aspects to that, where they ultimately look at it and they say like, okay, like, this is really uncomfortable for me to do, but I feel better when I do it. And I feel like I'm on a path or the road to recovery, so to speak, versus other folks who you do it. And it's like, dude, you know, we did that last time. Like, they just have in their mind, like, they don't want to do it, but they're willing to just appease me and try it. And then they come back and they're like, yeah, I don't want to do that ever again. You know? So yeah, those folks it's pretty tricky, to kind of really know that.
Yeah. Kyle, you threw out 10 sets. Oh, sorry, Ben, you'll go with yours, but then Kyle, hit on what you mean by 10 sets. I don't think we've ever talked about that study or that meta-analysis.
Yeah, so Zach's mentioned it a few times, but again, it kind of we throw a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah.
So there's that review paper by Schoenfeld, and there's others on it. I forget. It's just the name that I remember always when we talk about it. But basically, they showed that 10 sets of exercise per week was really kind of like an optimal level of prescription for muscle hypertrophy specifically. So and there's some data showing could be as few as 4, but also like the more trained an individual is, maybe they need more sets per week. But you know, from my perspective, I just kind of look at it from this perspective of, hey, I'm mostly working with untrained folks in rehab, people that are unfamiliar, and if I just have this sort of goal in my mind again of where I'm going, this kind of 10 sets per week, now I can figure out just by looking at their program if they've done enough. So for example, if I'm working with a knee, right, and I need their quadriceps specifically to get bigger, to get stronger, which is the most common thing in knee rehab, I know if I go and I look at a chart and it says this person's doing long arc quads and they're doing BFR, and I can kind of see all those parameters there. And who knows, maybe people have actually rated the amount of effort that person's put forth, so I know that they're working hard enough. There's enough fatigue within that visit. But if they're only really doing, like, say, that one kind of quad-centric exercise and they're in the clinic twice a week, if I break that down from a BFR perspective and I've got 30, 15, 15, 15, I've got 4 sets of BFR exercise, and that person is here twice a week, that only gives me 8 sets for the week, right? So I know just from kind of that Schoenfeld perspective of I'm really might not be doing enough for this individual, because probably only a couple of those sets are really substantial amounts of fatigue that individual's doing, and they're only here twice a week. However, if I go and I just look at a chart and I'm like, all right, well, this person's doing a leg press, it's going to get some quad. It's not isolating the quad, it's going to get some quad. And then they're also doing a long arc quad, and assuming load and effort and all these other things are kind of achieved, I can just kind of look at that and go, all right, well, that's 4 sets, long arc quad, 4 sets, leg press. That's 8 sets total in one visit. If that person just comes one other time that week, twice a week, that's 16 sets of exercise. And probably 8 of those sets, 4 of those sets are, no, I had it right. 8 of those sets for the week are into substantial fatigue, right? Because probably the last 2 sets of the leg press and the last 2 sets of the long arc quad, this person's really smoked, right? And so that's 4 sets really smoked. Visit 1, 4 4 sets, visit 2 really smoked. That's 8 sets in substantial fatigue. So I look at it from this weekly kind of volume perspective, which has been shown is really important for hypertrophy. And I can go, all right, I know this person's doing enough, right? But if I take that initial example that I gave of just a single exercise, if I just add another visit, 3 visits for the week, that gives me 12 sets. And so I can go, all right, that individual is probably doing enough. They're just kind of barely there, but they're probably doing enough, especially if they're like early on in rehab and the threshold for improvement is pretty low, right? I just know that I'm going to have to add some volume over time to really kind of keep progressing them, because the big thing with hypertrophy is weekly volume, if you will. That's kind of where that kind of comes from, the 10 sets per week and all that. So
one of the things that I wanted to bring up here that goes back to what Johnny, you and Zach were talking about was, you guys mentioned pain. And one of the really interesting things that I think comes out of the papers from Luke and Stephen is, from a pain perspective, it doesn't really look like we need that high of a pressure to have an effect. And so, and this is just for the lower extremity. We don't know the same thing about upper extremity, which is kind of the question we got asked was after shoulder surgery. But just in general, from those 2 papers, they looked at 40% occlusion and 80% occlusion on the leg, and 80% looks like it's better, but 40% occlusion on the leg was still doing something from a pain perspective. And if you're looking at a population that potentially struggles with exercise, has a chronic pain condition, maybe that makes it easier to get the foot in the door to say, okay, well, we can do something really easy. We can start at a low relative pressure and just give them a little bit of stress here. And maybe we create the win by saying, okay, you get a little bit of that analgesic effect. We're not going to kill you the first go around, and you get some buy-in to say, okay, that helped a little bit. It didn't hurt me. I felt pretty good after I got done. And then we look at what is the optimal prescription for the exercise effect that we want from there. And so I have to think it's probably similar on the upper extremity. You could probably go conservative, like you were saying, Zach, to begin with, figure out where they live, what they can tolerate, get a little bit of the analgesic effect. You're not shooting for the moon on the first go around, and then, work your way up from there. So I think that could be a really interesting part of what we see with BFR in those populations.
I want to add a little bit of nuance to what Ben said, because I think that's a really good point, Ben. However, I would potentially caution against sort of telling a patient, hey, this is going to help your pain, or hey, this might help your pain. I think it's a lot better approach to have that happen and the patient be interested in that. In the back of your head, the clinician, you're thinking, all right, I'm doing this because I might be able to achieve these effects. But if you tell a patient all of that and then it doesn't happen, because it might not, then you've kind of put yourself in a bad spot of making that of missing on a lot of things that you could manipulate, like, for example, the placebo effect. You're going to miss on that, because they have an expectation now, this is going to make my pain better, right? And what their pain being better might mean to them just kind of initially could be different than what they might experience. They might actually experience some sort of pain relief, but it might not be exactly how the individual would sort of define that too. So I think there's some layers to that you have to kind of think about when you're prescribing these things and what you're actually sort of telling the individual. So I just kind of wanted to layer that in a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think you want to tell your patient that you're going to give them relief as a target on the front end.
Dude, I love setting up my placebos. I'm like, you're gonna have pain relief, you're gonna get stronger, your growth hormones gonna shoot through the
and then
roof.
you pass them off the intern, Johnny. You already told us what's gonna happen. You can say it's Ben's fault.
I say, what did he do wrong?
Exactly. That didn't work. Oh my God.
Well, yeah, I think, Johnny, you brought up a great point. You definitely have to throw growth hormone into that conversation.
Always.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always this delicate nuance of working with folks because I agree, Johnny. It's good to kind of manipulate that a little bit if you can, but it's kind of a slippery slope. If you don't get it, then
for
what do
sure.
you do from there, kind of thing. Yeah,
just show them. Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say. Show them the Liver King and
it worked. The Liver King. Yeah, stay primal. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Oh, good grief. Good stuff, gents. We got a few more questions here, so we might try to keep these answers a little bit shorter because otherwise this podcast is going to end up.
Yeah, I've already had to go pee once.
3 hours. Johnny's checked out. He left the chat and came back to the chat. All while Zach was talking, I think. So
I made sure to mute the microphone while I was peeing.
You did good. You did awesome. We had a cameo appearance by Kylie while you were in the bathroom. We'll put in there later. And that was from Justin Lee. Thanks, Justin. We'll send you a T-shirt, my man. We'll get with you on that. But had an Instagram question from, I guess it's from Jackson Cole. You never know, like, if this is someone's actual name that's on Instagram, but
it's a cool
Jackson
name.
Cole 34. Yeah, he kind of sounds like a baseball player. I think a Jackson Cole sounds like a baseball name.
I think that's
quarterback. Could be
Garrett
quarterback.
Cole. You're thinking of Garrett Cole, I think.
No, I'm definitely not thinking of that.
Or Jackson Hole.
There's not anything that's like Garrett Cole # sticky stuff. Jackson Cole 34 on Instagram wanted to know, are there any recent developments in the literature regarding BFR and its effects or mechanisms on bone? Ben, and then let me hang on. And then I tell you what, let me just piggyback 2 questions here, because the next question is a bone question as well. It comes from J Zotto 11, which I think is James Zotto. He took our class a while back. I'm familiar with that name. He asked, what are the best practices for programming BFR in soldiers with bone stress injuries? I would just kind of shrink that down and say just programming in bone stress injuries, but I think he actually kind of works with some war fighters. So Ben, why don't you tackle our effects on anything recently on bone, mechanisms on bone, using for bone stress injuries? Tell us all about bone.
All right. As far as recent developments, I don't think we've had anything in the literature that's really changed any understanding or interpretation. I mean, the Methodist ACL paper that we've discussed multiple times previously is kind of the newest and potentially the best evidence we have of any direct effects on bone, and kind of came about as a secondary target in the study when they were looking at their DEXA scans.
So they didn't look at mechanisms or anything.
They
didn't provide us any explanation in terms of mechanisms, but they did show it did something to bone at least, which is cool.
Yeah, it was, it wasn't a study of did bone heal faster. It wasn't a study of did it increase bone mineral density. It really just showed that there was some preservation of bone mineral density compared to a control group where they had some loss of bone mineral density. So that's still a win for us. And obviously we could take that and say it looks like it's having some positive effects in comparison to the alternative, which would be, decrease in stress or unloading and having that decrease in bone mineral density happen. But yeah, nothing in that study that looked at mechanisms. And so I know, and we discuss this in the course and kind of go into the thoughts that are there and how it might be affecting bone, but it really is mainly from some of the animal literature and, from physiology pathways, looking at, is there, something from a hormonal standpoint, either from, growth hormone or VEGF that's translating over to an effect on the bone? Is there something from a fluid pressure standpoint that we get? And animal literature would suggest that there might be just from having this inflate deflate happen. And then we also look at this crosstalk between muscle and bone, and it looks like there has to be some stress on muscle and some resulting stress on bone in some context from a mechanical tension standpoint to have a good effect on bone. And then also from some of the potential myokine responses we get from muscle when there's some stress. Maybe we're seeing something with something like myostatin translating over to an effect on the bone if you reduce myostatin. So a lot of potentials and still a lot of questions as to what is the effect, how much of an effect, what does the dose need to be, and so a lot left to be understood here. But I think there's still a lot of potential. Probably better to use BFR than to just do a low load from what we think is there as of right now.
Yeah, and so backing up a little bit, just on like the Methodist study specifically, they basically showed that their control group, both groups really were losing bone mass. So they saw bone mass and bone density. They got both of those, correct? So they saw bone mass and so they got whole bone. They're getting whole bone mass, and then they're getting kind of like localized density measurements, correct? That's kind of how that data breaks down. And they showed in the involved limb in an ACL population that for the first 6 weeks, those two items were reducing. They were going down, right? And then they began BFR at what, like
They said around a week, day 7 or
pretty
so.
early, pretty early. They began BFR, and their BFR group actually seemed to kind of help restore some of what they had lost. And it was significant, I believe, that improvement from, it had dropped for the first 6 weeks, and then it increased. And I think that change from what they lost to what they regained was significant within that specific group, a within group change. But then the control group that involved limb, it really continued to lose bone mass and bone density, lost quite a lot more over the next 6 weeks. So at week 12, that control group had really lost bone mass, bone density, and your BFR group had regained some of what they had lost.
Yeah, I don't know if they said that the 6 week mark was a statistically significant change from
That's why there was a
baseline
question mark in there when
I
I said that.
It sure looked like it from the data that was presented, but I don't know that it really was.
So the initial loss was like 6%.
Yeah,
I think. And then Zach, Johnny, anything to add on that little kind of detail there?
Yeah,
I recall.
Yeah, well, not on that paper, but I was going to say that one of the things that I always kind of talk about with bone with folks is ultimately, everyone's like really familiar with Wolff's Law, but when they think about and apply Wolff's Law, they almost exclusively consider Wolff's Law as external ground reaction forces, and they negate the effect that a muscle contraction is going to have on bone. And muscle contraction has a huge effect on bone. And the other thing of it is when we talk about loading the bone, it's short dynamic bouts, and that's where the muscle contraction comes in. So there's definitely something to be said about using BFR, because a lot of times a muscle contraction that would be sufficient enough to kind of create some substantial tension on the bone is not going to be done with low loads, and it's not going to be tolerated if someone has an acute stress injury, stress reaction, fracture, things along those lines. And so if BFR can basically stimulate that response, I think that's kind of would be a good thing in an application in a clinical sense.
Yeah, the muscle contraction and the hypoxia, I think, are both two key components. And essentially, we just keep getting these mechanistic studies that show there's potential there. I was trying to pull them up because we had one just come out. The Brazilians did it. That if you did BFR, unfortunately, they use systolic blood pressure, but 70% versus 130%, they were looking specifically at parathyroid hormone, which is a regulator of calcium uptake. The higher pressure had significantly higher levels of parathyroid hormone than the more moderate pressure in resistance exercises alone. And, you go back to the carabolic stuff, bone specific alkaline phosphate goes up almost the same as lifting heavy. There's the water one that came out. What's the guy's name? Zaravar this year, just not too long ago, doing water exercises in osteoporotic women. versus water exercise with BFR. The BFR group had significantly higher IGF-1 and also significantly higher T scores. Bone mineral density was better in these elderly women. So I think we're just getting more and more and more. The mechanisms are all like pointing that direction. Like, okay, it seems that everything you would want to see keeps going up. Now we just need the studies, So now I think we can include that water one as another bone study. It was osteoporotic women. We got Lambert's, a clinical one. Hopefully the NASA folks are going to start showing us some things if they start really looking at it. And then I think Sherry's work in equine, they're really going to be looking at bone as well. And they're going to get a deep look because they can really get into that limb and look at it. So potential's there, the mechanisms are there. And I always said, even if it doesn't help bone, at least you're getting the muscle strong while you're dealing with the bone. And a strong muscle is always going to assist bone. The muscle bone crosstalk is huge. Those myokines play a huge role.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I tend to rely on, Johnny, at this point, is since we don't have the information on does bone heal faster, and I don't know that we'll really have that in a well-controlled way in humans, it's like, well, even if the bone doesn't heal faster, we still have a muscle problem. And this could really help with that.
Well, and the stress fracture protocols suck, It's like you saw them at our base, Ben. It's like, cool, you want to do the Alter G or aquatics? And that was kind of it, and we couldn't really do anything because if we go to frank fracture because we're pushing too hard, they're boarded out of the military. So it's like, okay, the slow graded approach. And it's like, shit, if I can use hypoxia and get the muscle strong at the same time, and after that 6 weeks or so, they get cleared and they're good to go at 6 weeks. Because the alternative is you wait for the bone to clear and then you go after the strengthening and start really pushing the load, and then you're just doubling your rehab time. So I think in those populations, especially this military population, I think we shorten the window, which is big.
Yeah, I think. And so if
I thought we were going to do a quick answer.
Yeah, that
doesn't work. Yeah.
Now with 4 people jumping in on contributing on everything, this ain't gonna happen. So but I did want to kind of talk maybe a little bit about James's, like because he's kind of talking about like this, your soldiers and those sorts of things. So presumably you have some folks that are in the military that are could have a few different scenarios. Maybe there's been this big spike in their activity because they just joined and they're in basic or something like that. Or these could be people that have been in the DoD, in the military for a while, and they've been kind of running and over time seeing these bone stress injuries. But I think the probably the big mistake there is, well, if you have a bone stress injury, it's not like it's an actual fracture. So you shouldn't be like totally removing load. If you're incorporating BFR, these people should still be loading. And from a bone perspective, that might involve impact. Like if we're really trying to dose exercise, like Zach was saying, some of these quicker muscle contractions and just literally the impact could be an important thing to kind of stimulate bone. I think, I of course, this is a good time to talk Keith Barr a little bit. He's shown maybe just these short durations of activity
6 minutes, baby,
seem to kind of have an effect. So, I think you probably should be looking at managing a bone stress injury from maybe a different angle than you might really kind of think about some other injuries. BFR certainly should kind of be incorporated there. It makes sense to address deficits in muscle size, muscle strength, areas where you cannot load, but you should still kind of have this sort of focus on, all right, I need to get load into this limb probably as quick as I can. And maybe
it's the paradox,
short,
you get a broken bone or you get a bone problem, and the thinking is, let's take everything away. Let's not load, let's not do anything. And bone needs stress. And so the problem in the military is you get diagnosed with one of these and you get put on a profile, and it's got specific things you can and cannot do. So you can't go outside those parameters of the profile lots of times. So you're limited to, they can only do low load activity. And anytime you see low load activity, it's like, well, hell yeah, I got a tourniquet that I'll put on with that, even if it's like on a bike. That's an easy thing to go after. And we're pushing the envelope with bone in the military. I mean, we've got it's called GLIDE. It's the Alter G study, where if you got a fracture, a true fracture, we're going to walk you right immediately. No non-weight bearing, unless it's intra-articular. It's get into the Alter G, and we're going to weight bear, and we're going to let symptoms be the guide. And we were already doing that protocol. So it's like, if you get out and it's like, my tibia is killing me and it looks swollen, oh, we pushed it too hard. Sorry, you can back off. But we're using a graded approach to treat bone almost like muscle, that it needs a stress and it will have a response. So that's a funded trial through Metric right now.
Yeah, sweet. I think from a resource perspective, one of the folks that I love on like the bone side of things, bone injury side of things, prescribing exercise is Rich Willie. He's got an Instagram, Montana Running Lab, I think is what it is, or something like that. But he's definitely kind of an authority in that space, and he's posted some super simple infographics and things in terms of like, exercise dosage and whatnot too. So that would be a rabbit hole that I would go down if I was kind of managing those folks routinely. So
another fun name,
yeah,
Rich Willie. Just seems fun to say.
Yeah, yeah, it does seem fun to say that. Cool. So, all right, another podcast question from Whitney 77777 on Instagram. That's a lot of sevens.
Yeah, that's a lot.
7776 was taken.
And I actually don't even know if it's Whitney. It might actually be Whiny. Now that I read that again, I just sort of assumed it was Whitney, but it might be Whiny sevens. Whiny sevens. I don't know what that means, but this individual's in PTA school, and I for some reason I thought it was a female, but I actually don't know that because I was thinking Whitney, but it says Whiny, so it could be.
The questions are taking so long because Kyle can't stop.
I can't read them.
Jesus,
can't
cue the question.
Oh my word, so bad. They're never letting me take over the podcast again. It's been nice knowing y'all. This person wanted to know about ankle sprains and wanted more info on ankle sprains. I'm assuming how to use BFR after an ankle sprain. Any published data that you guys are familiar with, Johnny or Zach? I'm not familiar with anything that's published.
Only not acute, only the chronic, and it was specifically at the peroneals.
Oh, peroneals, that's right.
Yeah. Acutely wise, man, my go-to is closed chain mini squats, single leg, and heel raises, preferably single leg if they can do it. I had a pretty bad ankle sprain, basically 72 hours or so before I went to Montana back in 2020. This thing, I had pitting edema, could barely walk. It was on a Wednesday night. And then I did BFR that night. And then the next day, and by Friday, I legit could do a single leg broad jump. I could do single leg vertical jumps, and went and walked in the mountains for roughly 60 miles over the next week. And I was completely fine. I had bruising the whole 9 yards, but I really had no pain whatsoever. I have used that same kind of protocol or same approach with a lot of acute ankle issues and acutely with people coming out of boots, and have had really good results. So that is kind of my go-to with acute ankle sprain.
So use it early, use it to get people moving and getting some sort of intense exercise off of that. I remember years back, the Loyola Marymount folks had told me they liked getting it on, just getting the cuff on, inflate, deflate, immediately after kind of thing. I think we all have said it a million times, but worth saying it again. If you can add movement, if you can add activity, then you should really add that. So, but from a pain perspective, really seems to, anecdotally have some value. And certainly with an ankle sprain, plantar flexion strength is typically the thing that people have kind of that hardest time getting back some of that range of motion. So Zach got both of those. Bye. adding a single leg heel raise, and then also adding kind of a closed kinetic chain sort of squat type movement. He's going to get some dorsiflexion in that. So kind of hitting both of those targets that you're just going to have a hard time with an ankle sprain, and adding BFR to it. So yeah,
I did a review paper with John Faltus and Corbin Hett on chronic ankle instability. And basically it was John's protocol. He'd had some pretty good success with chronic ankles in the NBA. So we went over his theory and his whole protocols on there, and some really sexy pictures, et cetera. So we can throw that one on the podcast notes if you want.
Yeah.
If you want to see what they were doing in the NBA with this.
We will add it to the podcast notes.
Mm-hmm.
Just to cite me if you publish. That's my main goal.
Yeah. No one would ever not cite you, would they, Johnny?
Thank you. I cite myself.
Yeah. Johnny's favorite thing. Self-citation. All right. So then Whiny Sevens also asked, what about using BFR on the leg with something like maybe a clamshell to get the glutes? What do you guys, want to know, how does that work? It's the $1 million question. I don't think we need to go down the road of how does this work above the cuff. If you want to know that, come take our class. I think we've actually done a podcast on how does it work above the cuff. There's a lot of different theories. Let's go specifically to the question of glute exercise clamshell. What do you guys think? Ben, why don't you handle that one? Glute exercise clamshell BFR, is that going to work?
I mean, it does something. If you have a chance to try it, and I always tell people when they ask, about the proximal stuff, just try it. Let me know how it feels. It seems to be more fatiguing than without BFR, even though you're targeting a muscle that's proximal to the application of the tourniquet. Sometimes I think that the clamshell just may not be a long enough lever with BFR to really get the stress that we want. But I think that if all you have available is to do clamshells to create some stress for the glute, then adding a tourniquet to that exercise is probably better than the exercise alone. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
I don't know that I would choose a clamshell exercise as my absolute best choice for increasing muscle size, muscle strength of the glute max. But if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. But I think, if you need those things, then probably need to be progressing towards like a squat kind of movement, some sort of hip extension component. As
was
well.
a question for glute max with a clamshell?
It just says glute exercise. So I mean,
if you're doing clamshells for glute max, you're missing the whole story there.
Yeah. I don't think that's where I would go.
Yeah.
Straight away.
Listen to the proximal ones. There's podcasts out there.
Yeah, we've got a few different ones on proximal. So lots of stuff in terms of theory and whatnot available. And so then last question from Whiny Sevens.
Jeez, Whiny Sevens.
I swore it was Whitney, but it's Whiny. Or maybe I copied it wrong.
Maybe
There's
you
no
just
telling.
wrote it down. Yes.
It's very possible, but I'm pretty sure I copied and pasted. So anyway, can you use BFR for a multi-muscle exercise and have one on your leg and one on your arm at the same time? So this is tough because I think multi-muscle exercise, I think of like a compound movement, like a squat or a bench press or something like that. I'm not typically thinking an exercise where you move one arm and one leg at the same time. I'm going to kind of piggyback that question into our final question here, and then we'll tidy some things up. But our last question comes from MarkLink_PT on Instagram. This person was curious about the results of using 4 cuffs versus 1 cuff when doing, say, for example, a leg exercise. Zach, what kind of thoughts do you have here, man?
Yeah. So
kind of, I guess maybe the question ultimately is like, it's kind of a systemic question, maybe cloaked in adding cuffs in a lot of different regions and lots of muscles working at once. What do you think?
I don't know. I can't think of an exercise that comes to mind where I would do a low load repetitive type exercise where I'm incorporating the legs and arms at the same time. To me, that's going to be more of an explosive type movement, like I don't know, like a clean and press or that type of a deal, where it's not going to necessarily be, I'm not cleaning and pressing 75 times trying to get this metabolite response. What I would typically say, and this falls into what I tell people that think that they want to do some supersets during the rest period, just to kind of get that in. BFR, we're talking about getting the exercise done in roughly 6 to 7 minutes. I would say just give that muscle group that you want to kind of target from an accessory type standpoint with a superset, or if you're trying to do, I don't know, like a leg and an arm, just do one of those at a time and then kind of go from there. Because the one that you're trying to do during the rest period, or the one that's like the kind of accessory, not main component of the lift, it's not going to get its fair due, so to speak. So just do that separately. And then when it comes to 4 cuffs, no, I don't. I've never done that before. I would say, again, it goes back to what I said previously. I'm not going to really do an exercise where I'm targeting all 4 limbs at the same time. And then, potentially you could say, from a safety standpoint, is this even a good idea? You have the Takana study from 2005 who did bilateral knee extensions, and they showed roughly a 10% reduction in stroke volume. And so that was just in the legs. And then so what happens now if we're fully occluding the venous return out of the arms as well? Exactly. That's a lot of load on the vascular system. And so what are we, trying to accomplish? And again, should we just give either the lower extremities or the upper extremities their own exercise to kind of train?
Yeah, we hear people do this all the time. We hear people teach it, and typically they're using a crappy cuff that is probably barely getting any occlusion at all. Because if you're doing it right, you ain't going to be able to do that.
That's right. I mean, it's going to be significantly, it's going to be really uncomfortable, especially in the lower extremities, but
Yeah, I mean, and I think you did a good job, Zach, of coming around at this question of, it's an exercise question of what are we trying to achieve? What is our goal? If you're doing something that is more of the total body or incorporates the legs and the arms at the same time, maybe, the exercise there is not where we're really doing what we tend to think of with BFR. It's probably just not our best target there. And then it definitely does bring up the device question of what kind of occlusion are we applying if we are looking at applying BFR with the exercise. And if you're getting any kind of significant occlusion from the device that you're using, you're probably not going to be looking at applying it to all 4 limbs at the same time. But we don't really have anyone that's looked at that from what I understand. And maybe that's, part of what guides our decision making on, is it a good idea for us to go after all 4 limbs or stick to 1 or 2 at a time?
Good.
Nothing to add there. Zero evidence. Probably not cuff, probably not doing much at all if you can do all 4. I agree with all that. So
I'd just say one other thing that just to kind of end that all is, even though we have the ability to do bilateral exercises in the clinic, I pretty much always do unilateral exercises. I may train the other limb, but I think when you have this discussion, you need to, or you consider this, you have to factor in that the involved limb is going to be trained at a significantly different load than what the uninvolved side is. So I very rarely even do bilateral at the same time. So
Totally agree, Zach. I mean, from a rehab perspective, which is kind of the angle we generally take, it's, extremely uncommon for me to do a bilateral exercise.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I see people doing squats with unilateral BFR all the time on Instagram, and I just kind of go, I don't know about that. I know what's going to happen when you start getting tired.
Yeah, you see it. It's a big shift.
It's a big shift, and even that, like, even if you were just doing a lunge with BFR on one leg, your quad's going to get tired, which means you're going to maintain a more vertical tibia. You're going to hinge more at the hip. You're going to change how you're moving just with an exercise when you're not like locked into a particular type of movement. And in rehab, a lot of times we really need to force people to move a certain way. And the only way you can do that sometimes is really kind of constraining the environment, which a machine helps you do a lot. There's other ways to do it, but definitely kind of being in a specific machine really sort of helps you do that. So anyhow, that's good stuff. So done with questions here, but some other things we wanted to talk about. The biggest one being the New York thing. So many of you that follow us in our little in our Facebook Inside Circle, our little private group that we have there, we were really trying to keep y'all informed, and then as much as we could kind of on the rest of our channels as well. Something that happened time frame wise, I think it was the summer. It might have been like May or somewhere in there. One of our buddies, Nick Rolnick, basically applied to get some CEU approval in New York for a new class he was putting together on BFR, and it got denied. And it got denied CEU approval. The reason it was denied was that an individual within the government structure in New York that oversees the practice of PT said that they didn't think BFR was within scope for physical therapists. That kicked off a whole cascade of events that kind of swept across New York. We were helping Nick as much as we could with info kind of from our end and doing our kind of own research. I went down the wormhole of learning how the practice of physical therapy is governed in the state of New York. And it's, to be quite frank, it's a shit show. The way PT is governed in New York is an absolute disaster. And if you're a PT in New York, you need to be, my opinion, paying attention to Nick, paying attention to a guy named Brian Goonan, and anybody else that they start kind of tagging into things, because you guys honestly need to take back some control of how PT is governed in New York. Essentially, you have a board in New York that is an advisory board. They have zero power whatsoever. They can make recommendations to the secretary that is within the educational system in New York. That individual is appointed. Presently, it is a retired attorney who has no background in physical therapy whatsoever. Her job, we don't really even know, but apparently she has unilateral decision-making power for what is within scope of practice for physical therapists, as well as, best I can tell, other professions as well, because she is the secretary for not only the Board of Physical Therapy or the profession of physical therapy, but she's secretary for a number of other professions as well. And so I think physical therapists should govern physical therapists. I think that's how it works in Texas. I know it's how it works in California. I don't know how it works in Georgia. Is that how it works in Georgia, Zach? Do physical therapists govern physical therapists? Yeah. I mean, like, we have an executive officer in California, but we have like actual board meetings where our board meets and they schedule them and they keep minutes and they have agendas and all these things. New York has none of that. So at any rate, what happened was Nick applied for this approval through the APTA in New York, and the APTA, someone at the APTA essentially sent this question off to this individual, this secretary, and that secretary wrote an opinion. It's very lawyery if you read it and you kind of understand the context. And so basically the APTA said, all right, well, apparently we can't approve this kind of thing. Very long story short, now that I've kind of given you the lay of the land in New York in terms of how PT is governed, we were able to, along with Nick and some others, submit answers to a number of questions that were posed. Some of those questions were quite clearly not from a physical therapist, because they had no idea like the role of a physical therapist and what assistive versus restrictive means or anything like that. So there's that angle. But we were ultimately able to get a ruling that said physical therapists may use BFR in practice. So did I miss anything on the New York thing there, guys? It's a pretty annoying whole process and very disappointing, quite honestly, to see.
It was a cluster. Took too long. It's reversed. So
yeah,
thank God. It's good. It's happened twice. North Carolina had it, but it was a blip. Within a very short amount of time, they were able to see, okay, we're going to reverse this. The key points I think that came out of both rulings is they said, understand your personal scope of practice. If you're going to do this, make sure
what that is, Johnny.
Well, you're better at it. You wrote the whole thing.
Okay, I can do that. We'll go back to that. Go ahead. Keep going. I didn't know that.
Well, no, you've got the professional scope, which is basically what our profession, says kind of that we can do. You have what's the middle one? The legal.
You have essentially kind of like your jurisdictional.
So what does your state law say? And then you've got your personal. And so your personal is basically if something happened and you got taken to court for what you did, how would you justify that what you were doing to that patient, you knew how to do it? So have you done anything to check the boxes and say, I know how to use a tourniquet, or I've taken an advanced course in BFR, because we're not taught this stuff in school. And so you have to check this personal scope of practice. So both North Carolina and New York,
you got to prove it. Which means you can't just say, oh, I read some papers, right? You gotta be able to substantiate why this intervention that you performed on a patient that came to you and trusted you to do no harm. How can you prove that you have the requisite skills and knowledge to perform this intervention
on something that you weren't taught in school? So both of the rulings, yes, it's fine to do, but you have to check your personal scope of practice.
Well, and just to give Nick a hard time, because I think that's a great thing to do here.
Sure.
Nick, we might have to talk about how you do your applications for the state of New York, because I just applied for next year for New York and we got an approval back within a week. So
we've been approved there for years. What the hell?
Come on, man.
Tell them not to do not apply in any other states, rural Nick, because we've been able to do it with no problem at all.
That's too funny.
Hysterically, he's gonna love that.
Well, anyways, it's good to go. Nice summary.
Good to go.
So
all right.
We're
back.
Thank goodness, man. I kind of a teaser. So in the new year, I think hopefully one of the first podcasts we're going to do is something that we actually really intended to do this year and just kind of got rolling, but we want to bring on the authors of the clinical practice guideline for the management of venous thromboembolus for physical therapists. So there is a new kind of an update to that Dr. Ellen Hillegas and two other individuals that I just am having a terrible time remembering their names contributed to. And so Johnny and I had the opportunity to kind of chat with them sort of at the beginning of the year. I think that was like March that we did that. And that was kind of, the genesis of that was they had a talk at CSM, and actually our buddy Jimmy McKay for PT Pintcast had them on his podcast. And that was really great. And so, probably from a safety perspective, even still to this day, I think the biggest question that we get is whether or not BFR might form a venous thromboembolus or might kind of negatively impact the venous thromboembolus. So we figure, why not get the absolute experts on to talk about that? And so just wanted to kind of tease that for you. I helped with ACL study day recently. So we did a kind of a BFR specific ACL study day, which you can, I think if you just Google ACL study day, you'll find the website. But that brought on, we put together an agenda of Chris Fry, who has done a ton of BFR work. We had Luke Hughes on there. We had Corbin Het, who we've mentioned a few times now, he from Methodist Houston, who's part of that ACL study that they did at Methodist. And then we had our friend Heather Milligan from Elite Orthosport out in Los Angeles. Had all of them kind of come on and tackle different topics around BFR and using it in the rehabilitation after ACL reconstruction. I think we might actually do another one potentially in 2023. Matt Bobman, who runs that, does a fantastic job. We've supported that ACL study day from its genesis way back when we had an actual meeting out in LA, and that was at UCLA. We had about 100 folks out there. It was fantastic, and I think Matt's gonna maybe consider tackling some in-person stuff in the future. So just kind of keep your eyes on that space. He does a lot of good work, brings a lot of fun people on. One of the things that I took away from that I wanted to tell you guys, I think I told Johnny, but I didn't tell the rest of y'all. Dr. Fry, when he was talking about their sham protocol, they basically have a Delphi unit that's programmed in a way that it's providing a very minimal restriction pressure, but essentially the screen says it's providing 80% pressure. So they really have this cool ass sham. So, right, I mean, because that's part of the really huge problem with BFR research is the inability to sham BFR. Like, how do you make people think they're getting BFR when in fact they're not? And so the neat thing about the Delphi is, like, well, you got the screen and it's showing this pressure adjustment and it's doing all of these different things.
How did he do that? He got Delphi to do that?
I don't know. It's he said it and I went, that is absolute genius. And I kind of told him on sidebar, I'm like, hey man, that's cool. I think that's really going to kind of reshape sort of the sham side of things within the BFR research space. And he was like, yeah, that's awesome. That's kind of what we were hoping. So
because like in our protocols, we basically say we turn the machine around so they can't see it. We inflate it to 20 and we
as the cuff is sliding off somebody's leg.
20 it kind of hold on. So
I thought just from like just kind of like, hey, here's where things are going in the literature. Like, that's pretty slick to have. I mean, that's obviously not a perfect sham, but that's about as legit as I think you could get in terms of a sham protocol. So I thought that was pretty neat. Wanted to kind of tease, Johnny recently did an event at Sacred Heart University. We did that in conjunction with PT Pintcast. So Jimmy came out, y'all had like kind of a big panel interview, live podcast kind of deal, right, Johnny? And did a little happy hour after. And
they rented a bar out on campus. It was all good. My kind of podcast event. It was good. Go to PT Pintcast. I think he's got that on there.
Yeah, PT Pintcast. And so we look to probably do some more of those events. So kind of around the country, maybe at PT schools and various things. So reach out if you'd be interested in hosting us. Pay attention if you'd like to kind of attend, and just sort of, any opportunity to kind of come here, people that are experts, quote unquote experts in a certain area of work, but also just kind of hear new voices. I think it's always a lot of fun. Speaking of new voices and BFR stuff, we got CSM coming up in February. Johnny's got 2 different talks, right? One on
Last
shoulder and
freaking
then-
day of CSM. Thanks a lot, APTA.
Shove it in there.
They said they saved the best for last to try and keep people from flying
that what
out.
they told
I
you?
was actually, that's what they
Yeah.
told me. So yeah. But we got the shoulder one with Jeremiah from the Astros and Corbin. So we're gonna be talking about BFR for the shoulder and the throwing
from what team? What team are they from, Johnny?
Stros, baby.
didn't-
Stros. We're gonna
was
show
that
how
the-
you win
was
World
that the-
Series.
2022 World Series
Mhm.
champion Houston Astros. Is that who they're?
Yep. And then I've got one with Cahalan and his group in the cardiopulmonary
Hey,
section, which
right
is going
on.
to be pretty cool.
What
Yeah.
is that? What is that one? What are y'all talking about?
We were talking about it for lung and potentially with long COVID.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And we have a
Right
paper
on.
coming out looking at BFR's use with some preliminary work with lung transplants. And Cahalan's about to get some units in the ICU down there in the hospital to get some pilot data right before
That's
CSM.
incredible.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
very, that's really cool.
And I'm just going to
That's
sit there and
cool.
not understand what the hell they're talking about.
Also wanted to just kind of say there's a bunch of posters on BFR this year. Of course, we had a ton of conversations last year, especially around like neurologic populations, that sort of thing. So if you're going to be there in San Diego, I feel like CSM is going to be a lot of fun this year. Johnny and Zach and Ben and I will all be there. Come by the booth, get a t-shirt if you want. We will be kind of attending talks, and Johnny, of course, giving them. And then there's a neuro BFR talk that I saw. I can't remember the people that are doing that. I actually looked it up and I didn't know them, but if anybody who listens to the podcast actually knows the folks that are doing the neuro BFR talk, send them our way. It'd be fun to have them on and chop it up on using blood flow restriction in neurologic populations. Our buddy Brian Goonan's got a poster, so he'll be out there. Brian from HSS, I believe their poster is on using BFR in the geriatric population. So lots of cool stuff happening at CSM. So
Mark Menaggio's going to have a poster on his MS pilot work. And that study's still
I
going.
love Johnny's pronunciation.
Menaggio. But also hype in Mark, he just got the VA grant for Parkinson's disease and BFR study. So that will be starting up
Sweet.
next year.
Awesome.
So he's
Yeah,
kicking ass over there at Colorado.
very cool. Very cool.
What are we on? Like 5 hours?
Stuff, guys.
I mean, like
Yeah,
my ass is
really
numb.
long, man. I'm tired too. My dad's calling me. We probably got to wrap this thing up. Anything you guys learned this year that you're just like, man, I just really wanted to kind of hit this out there, get it out there? Anything?
Don't
Any
let
thoughts
Kyle
about
host a
what's coming?
podcast.
Yes.
Questions.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Go,
We
Kyle.
got it.
You got something you learned? Interesting or good?
I do. Yeah.
I can tell you want to say something.
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Really, I'm fine wrapping it up. But I did have something on the agenda. This is
Let's hear it, man.
So I've been working with a buddy of mine. He's a deputy sheriff in the county where I live. So I got to know him through some work that I have done through the years with our department or our county sheriffs. He reached out to me. He's getting discharged from PT, and he's like, Kyle, and this guy, he's kind of like an amateur bodybuilder dude. He looks like Mr. Clean. He's huge, like 6'5", big old broad shoulders, and just muscles kind of everywhere. And so very used to resistance training. And so he knew kind of what I was doing with BFR. I talked to him a little bit about it here and there. Super interested, kind of before he had total knee. Like any true meathead, he went ahead and just did both knees at the same time. And then gets discharged from PT. So he's like 5 months post-op. And he texted me and he says, hey man, I'm getting cut loose from PT. My range of motion is great, but my quads suck. Like they're just not, they're not strong. It's even kind of just hard to sort of walk normally. and he was wondering if BFR might really be helpful with him. And I said, well, gosh, man, it kind of sounds like maybe, but you're also this far out. We tend to kind of think we might be able to load you by now. So at any rate, I go out, I look at him, and he was just so far behind. So we started BFR with him just to kind of get him going. His one leg did great. It actually, within probably like 2 or 3 weeks of doing BFR, we probably could have just kind of transitioned to sort of traditional loading, but he had another limb, his other limb, his right leg, really even having a hard time, just doing unweighted long arc quad, like could never get the full knee extension actively on his own, right? And so, in my head, I thought, all right, well, maybe he's just weak, right? And we just kind of get him stronger in what range he has, and that kind of comes back. And he saw some improvement from doing what we did, but that just didn't really get him over the hump that I needed to get him over. And so it just so happened I was listening to a podcast with Lynn Snyder-Mackler it was the JOSPT podcast. Claire Ardern hosts it. I think that's how you say her name. She has the coolest voice and accent. That voice would put me to sleep in a heartbeat, just as an aside. But Lynn Snyder-Mackler was on. She's been on a few different times. But Dr. Mackler kind of threw in this little nugget about in ACLs where they've used the bone tendon bone graft. Sometimes that patella tendon will kind of stretch out. And she's like, it kind of makes it hard to get fully extended. And I thought, I've tried neuromuscular stim with my buddy. I've tried all these different things. Let me try this with him. And so basically what they do to address that is you need to get the hip in extension, right? Because typically if you're doing a long arc quad kind of movement, you need to be, you're typically in like a seated position. So you're in, say, 90 degrees of hip flexion or something like that. If you're on a you're in kind of this shortened rectus femoris type position. So, but if you extend that hip and you get tension through the rectus, it actually looks like in these people that have this problem where that tendon has kind of stretched out, they're able to create enough force that they can go through that full arc of motion. And so I did this with my buddy. For him, I laid him prone on a bench, and we had a cable system that I rigged up to kind of hook onto his foot. And sure enough, man, he was able to extend that knee prone, through the full range and control it. Yeah. And we've been able to load it now, and so we're kind of doing this hybrid thing of I'm loading him up in that manner, but then I'm also kind of using some BFR in a low loaded fashion with neuromuscular stim to kind of hit that. So it was pretty impactful for me in terms of just like how to, well, for one, I was like, I'm not getting what I need out of him, and I'm not really sure why, and then when I heard that, I thought, oh, this is going to be the perfect thing to try. So for those of you that, work with folks after ACL reconstruction, total knee, if you see this where people just cannot seem to produce enough force to create that full knee extension, maybe that's what's going on, and it seemed to be what's going on with him. It's definitely made a huge improvement in how he's feeling and his gait and that sort of thing. He still has some deficits in strength, and so we could kind of go down the rabbit hole of why that might be, but he's had months and months and months of basically ambulating and locking that knee as quickly as he could, because he couldn't control those last few degrees of knee extension. So that was a cool experience for me.
So it's helping. It is helping, huh?
Yeah, it really is.
Pretty
yeah.
Cool. Well, you see that with the Achilles, if that thing gets stretched,
you're
screwed. It's so hard. That tension is so important.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
That is a good story, Kyle.
Thanks. How's that for closing out?
That's interesting.
The podcast. So do I get to host the podcast again then, Johnny? Did I redeem myself? What's that?
Zoom
That's a
just
movie
said,
quote.
We've run out of cloud storage. It says. So, I guess not.
That's awesome.
Oh gosh! All right, guys.
All right.
That was fun.
Nice end of year. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays to everybody out there. Looking forward to a fun 2023.
Cheers.
All right.
Cheers.
Peace out.
Yep.
Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast. Owens Recovery Science is a single source for PTs, OTs, ATCs, DCs, MDs, and other medical professionals seeking certification in personalized blood flow restriction rehabilitation training. Find them online at owensrecoveryscience.com.
One last thing before you get out of here. Quick moment just to say thanks for listening to the podcast. I think we've probably said it 2 or 3 different times now, but we really mean it. But we also want to make sure that you, when you listen to this podcast, that you understand it's not medical advice. We do our best to make sure the information that we give through this podcast is as accurate as it can be, but it should not be used to treat patients. Those decisions need to be made by a physician, by the appropriate rehab clinician, those people that are licensed to care for that individual in that particular state, nation, etc. And so this also goes for any guests that we bring on the podcast. They're not providing medical advice. This information that you have received here as entertainment should not be taken in that way at all. And it should neither be used as expert witness or testimony in any sort of legal proceedings. So thanks for listening to that and understanding that, and we will see you next time. Or wait, we're not going to see. We'll hear. No, we'll listen. You'll hear us. Yeah. Thanks. Okay.